So again, what we're talking about is trying to define what a good versus a mediocre versus a bad letter of recommendation is. And this is an example from an article by Landrum in 2009 where he kind of tried to define this. And this is a moderate letter. It's probably not going to hurt the application, but it's certainly not going to help it either. So you can notice first, it's fairly short, 3 paragraphs, and they're fairly short paragraphs. The first one is who the person is, that it's a letter of recommendation and an application. And notice, graduate program in social psychology. So this letter doesn't even say what the program is or what university it is. Now, it does say that he's glad to write a letter of support. The next paragraph is fairly short. It's how he knows this student. They've taken a couple of classes, most recently a research methods classes. Notice he didn't list the grades in those classes, probably because she got B's. He's being nice here. He admits that there is a fairly lack of interaction and that he really just doesn't know the student very well. But from his observations, he does believe the student is attentive. He probably looked at the attendance of those classes, saw that she got all her assignments in on time, that she was in class, and therefore he gives a recommendation. I recommend Julie Finden for your graduate program without reservation, but not highly recommended, not this is a student that you can't pass on, just recommended. This is kind of a little bit of faint praise, and we talked about that very briefly in the previous video, the idea of being damned with faint praise. Now, if this student already has a couple other good letters, has a good GRE and a good GPA, this letter is probably not a problem at all. But if this is the strongest letter that student has, and that student either had an issue with a lower GRE or GPA, this is not a letter that's going to help the admissions committee decide to go ahead and admit this student. Here's an example of a better letter of recommendation. And again, at this point, notice that we now have more details. We have multiple classes. We have actually good performance in the class. We also have information about how the student interacts in other situations. We have information about how the student has done additional work with the faculty member. It's talked about the skills. In other words, this is someone that the person actually knows. And notice at the end in bold, I recommend Kevin Howard Locke to you with my highest recommendation and without reservations. This is a good letter of recommendation. It's about 2 pages long. It goes into great detail of why this person would be a great graduate student and then puts it very succinctly and in bold at the end. This is the kind of letter you're hoping to get. So for that letter of recommendation, we've already talked about the packet and what the packet needs to contain. But you may also want to consider giving a little bit more information, such as the courses you've taken with the letter writer and when they were and your grade. Remind them of this information. Some letters may require an actual physical form sent in with them or some form of waiver. If so, make sure that is included in your applications. Again, you want your CV, you want your GPA, you want your personal statement, you want a copy of your transcripts. If you did extremely well in the faculty members' classes, you may want to remind them about how you got 100 on the paper or a 98 on your tests. And again, if the actual letter has to be physically mailed in, make sure to include pre-stamped envelopes addressed to the program. And finally, there should be a master list listing all of the schools names, and the program's names, how they should be submitting the information, online, in letter form, physical form, and the deadlines. You want to make sure that you have done everything you can to show your organizational skills, to show your dedication, and to show your motivation in how you are giving the professor information about writing the letters. And taking this time to do all of this is probably going to get you a couple more lines in that letter talking about how dedicated and motivated you are. A final word, you do want to check back with your letter writers, and we kind of touched on this already in one of the previous video lectures. I would check with the graduate programs first to find out if they received the letters. If they did not, find out who you need to talk to, and then very briefly check in with them and make sure that they've remembered to do the letters. Once all of your letters have been submitted, I definitely suggest that you take the time to thank your letter writers as at a minimum, either in person or via email. And this is one of those times where I actually would suggest it's not a bad idea to put a small little thank you card in their mailboxes. So let's talk a little bit again about why that face-to-face request is important and what we should be doing in a face-to-face request for a letter writer. Like I said, it allows for discussion. In other words, you're not asking, can you write me a letter? You want to ask them specifically, can you write me a good supportive letter of recommendation? That gives them the out to maybe let you know about their doubts. Again, remember, faint praise can be damaging. It also allows details to be asked about. So the professor now has the opportunity to say how many programs you are applying to. Are they PhD? Are they master's programs? What types of letters are needed? Are there specific forms? Am I going to get emailed by the organizations to do it online? Do I have to give the letters to you in a sealed envelope? Do I have to send the letters myself physically? Also, some programs actually require not a generic letter of recommendation, but actually specific questions answered in essay form of your letter writer. If that is the case, and you know that, you want to let them know that as well. Again, we talked about the time. 4 weeks minimum, 1 month, and again, give as much information as you can to help your letter writer. How would you answer questions posed about you? And again, remember that you can also then ask them to give you an edited CV back, and you can also give letter writing instructions to those that may not understand how to write a letter of recommendation. Assume professors in your field will know how to write that letter. But if you are having to get letters of recommendation from someone outside of the academic field that you're applying to, it's not a bad idea to give them some instructions on what that letter should look like. You've already got one sample from this slide set, but also take a look at, like I said, some of the links about how to write letters of recommendation. You also want to make sure that you're giving them the information that you want them to showcase. So give them the evidence of the performance in your class. Give them your transcripts and GREs. In some cases, you may want to remind them of a particularly good paper you wrote for them. And again, this should be organized as much as possible. And also, if there is an issue in your application, and what I mean by an issue is, for example, let's say you have a GPA below 3.0, but you think you're making a strong argument why that GPA should be ignored. You should let them know what that argument is. They may include it in their letter. You may have a really good GPA, but you did horribly on the GRE, and you plan to address that in your personal statement. Let them also know about that. In other words, give them as much information as you can so they want to write a longer, more detailed letter. Because the longer the letter, generally, the better that letter is going to be at making an argument that you should be allowed and accepted and chosen to go on to graduate school in the programs that you're applying to. So just briefly, what those letters need to contain. A good letter of recommendation will have an opening. The opening statement will identify who you are, will identify the program, and will identify how the writer knows you. The second paragraph will usually go into a little bit more information about the connection between the letter writer and you, the applicant. It will include whether or not you were in their research labs. It will include any extracurricular activities you've had that the professor is aware of. It will also include your performance in their various classes. And at this point is where we get to the superlatives, and this is where they're going to talk about, hopefully, how you're a good fit for graduate school. That you have the intelligence and cognitive ability to do well in graduate programs, that you are a problem solver, that you are tenacious, that you're motivated, that you have study and time management skills. The more they go into these details and the more they know about these details, the better that letter becomes. Generally speaking, it will then end with a prediction and a summary. And the prediction may be something like, I think you'll be very happy when you allow this person in your program. I expect them to do great things. And therefore, and the summary usually is the actual recommendation. So again, when we look at the superlatives, it's not just, it can also include analyzing and synthesizing information, oral and written skills, work habits, maturity and leadership. All of these are things that a professor may talk about in a letter of recommendation. And I want you to take a look at these 8 bullet points and think about, have I given my letter writers information about these 8 points to allow them to write about these? Have I given them examples of my work habits, my maturity? Have I made them aware of some of the leadership roles that I've had? Have they seen my presenting and writing skills, and are they able to talk about those? These are all things you want to think about as you actually are asking your letter writers. Again, the more work you do up front, it makes it easier for the letter writer to write you a good letter. Now, if you're in one of those rare situations where you actually have lined up three professors who know you very well, have experience with you in multiple classes, are all in your field, you can also think about potentially even tweaking further, kind of focusing each letter on a specific area. So, for example, you could ask one professor, can you really focus on my academic performance? Someone you've had a lot of classes with. Have another professor talk really a lot about your research because you've done a lot of research work with them. Maybe the third professor is someone you had a teaching assistantship with. You helped them teach a class as an undergraduate, or someone that has a lot of experience with your writing. So again, these are things not necessarily to worry about if you're just trying to get together three solid letters, but if you're actually in that very fortunate boat, if you will, where you actually have three solid professors writing you letters of recommendation, this is one more thing that you could potentially do. Because instead of the application committees getting three very good letters that all say the same thing, they're now getting three very good letters, and each one is taking the time to really focus on one particular aspect. And again, remember, check up on the letters, but again, top down and not bottom up checking. And by top down, I mean check to see if the actual program's got the email. Did they, or the letters of recommendation? And if not, then check up from the bottom up, asking the professor, I'm just double checking, did you actually get a chance to get this letter off? So hopefully that is cleared up a little bit. Like I said, it's impossible to make this process crystal clear because there is a lot of gray zone between that perfect letter recommendation and that bad letter recommendation. And it's hard to really figure out exactly what any application or admission committee is specifically going to be impressed by in that gray zone. So hopefully, though, you now have more information to where you can at least make an informed decision, and you know how to ask for that letter and make sure that you've given enough information that that letter will be a good letter that will help your application.